All right, guys. You can turn on your cameras for a second so we can all say hello. All right. Hey, everyone. Welcome to this session that I forget the name of because it's very long. We have 7 different presenters, a couple here in person, a couple online. Our goal for this session is to keep all of our presentations to less than 30 minutes so we have time for plenty of questions and answers at the end. So I hope you guys are thinking about questions as we go along. With that, let's get started. I think I'm first. All right. So my name's Josh Murfeld. I'm an assistant professor at the KDI School of Public Policy and Management, which is a South Korean-funded graduate school of public policy in Sejong City, South Korea. I'm also at the World Bank and IZA, and this paper that I'm going to talk about is joint work with David Newhouse, who's also at the World Bank and IZA. And so what we're doing in this paper, I have just one slide that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to talk you through it a little bit. What we wanted to do was to see how well we can estimate poverty using household survey data, specifically in countries where there isn't a recent census to help us do small area estimation. So what we do is we use geospatial data as the auxiliary data, and we compare several different methods. We compare kind of old school small area estimation, if you want to call it that, which is the red circle, EBP. And we also compare it with 3 other more kind of newer machine learning methods. Boosted regression forests, cubist regression, and XGBoost, extreme gradient boosting. And so what we do is we use these geospatial features that we pull, basically almost all satellite derived, and we use those as the explanatory variables in these 4 different types of models. And we do this using household level census data so that we actually know the truth. So in other words, what we're going to do is we're going to actually randomly sample households as if it were a real household survey from a unit level census record. And so we can compare our estimates from our pseudo survey to the actual truth. And these plots are what we get. These plots are predicted truth plots. So across the x-axis, horizontally, we have truth. And on the y-axis, we have our prediction across 100 different simulations, essentially, using, like I said, this real census data. And what we find is essentially that the 2 newer machine learning methods, boosted regression forest and XGBoost, outperform EBP. And kind of the thing I really like about this paper, the real value added, is we actually developed a bootstrap procedure for XGBoost to estimate uncertainty. And the coverage rates are around 95%, which is exactly what you would want it to be with 95% confidence intervals. The downside to XGBoost, though, is it's kind of a black box, right? So EBP, it's basically a regression. You can actually see coefficients. You can see how things are moving. XGBoost, that's not the case. So I am going to stop there and hand it over to Daniel, who's going to briefly discuss his paper. Daniel, go ahead. Let me know when you want me to switch slides.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Josh. That was super interesting. So I'm also at the World Bank, and I'll talk about a related topic, but in a situation where we're even more data deprived. So at the World Bank, we're monitoring the first SDG indicator to end extreme poverty by 2020. And for that, we need data on on income and welfare distributions for all countries of the world for any given year. And often we'll have some of the household survey data that Josh talked about, or census data that we can use to extrapolate backwards and forwards in time. But for about 50 economies globally, we have no distributional information whatsoever at any point in time. And what to do with those economies is sort of the topic of the paper I'll present now. So Josh, you can go to the next slide. So you can imagine that we care about 2 things. We care about how well a particular how well we can explain distributions using some method. So that's what I'll have here on the squared. But the challenge we're facing really is that the countries where we have no household surveys or no distributional data whatsoever, they tend to lack all kinds of other data as well. So we have this trade-off between how well we can use some data to predict distributions versus how many countries we can actually fill the gaps for using these data points. So that's what we have on the x-axis, and ideally we want to be as far to the right as possible, such that we have a method that we can apply to all the countries where we don't have any distributional data at all. And you might think, why not use some of the satellite data that Josh talked about, such as night lights? So we tried, and the innovative part of this paper is that we have a way of just using mean night lights in one data point for a country to recover a whole distribution. If we use night lights, we can explain about 0.1 of the variation we want to, which might sound like a little, but a lot of what we want to explain in terms of countries distributions is really noisy. So 0.1 is actually okay. But our challenge is that even satellite data actually is not covering all the economies we want to at all time periods, particularly because it doesn't go back far enough in time. So what we've done is try to use 1,000 different variables to predict countries' income or consumption distributions, and you'll see the results here. And what we're interested in, if you click on the next one, is sort of the data points that are to the top right as much as possible. Plot. Josh, if you go to the next one, please. So the points that are to the top right of this orange line here are the ones that can really well predict income distributions and/or are available essentially everywhere at all years. And final click, Josh, sorry, is you can see sort of the usual suspects that come out, the variables that are most informative for predicting welfare distributions, even if we have no data whatsoever, is information like GNI, so gross national income, or HFCE, household final consumption expenditure. So some national accounts variables. But unfortunately, those data points are not available for many of the cases where we actually lack survey data. But what you can see then, if we on this orange arc, is that there's some other information we can use, such as the urban population share, which actually predicts countries' distributions rather well and is available nearly everywhere at all years. So what we've done is try to use this to create a very simple model that can be implemented in just a couple of lines to create a distribution of income or consumption for all countries of the world for any given year. And let me stop there. Thank you so much.
Arturo?
Thank you very much, Josh. And good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today as we discuss how we can further leverage on data to bring the needs of the poor people at the fore of policymaking. So before I continue, let me just a quick shout out to some of my colleagues from ADB who also helped put up this presentation, Daniel and Seth. And of course, our collaborators on the National Statistical Offices of the Philippines and Thailand. And I think some of their representatives are also in this room. So basically what we tried to address in the study, in the feasibility study that we made is, okay, so these two NSOs, Philippines and Thailand, they're publishing regularly poverty statistics. But in some instances, we need more granular data than what the published numbers can afford, because as we know, usually this poverty data come from surveys, and to be able to have more granular poverty data, um, you need to increase sample size. And that's an option that is not always practical or feasible for many government agencies that collect this data. So what we try to do is um, ask ourselves, how can we enhance the granularity without necessarily increasing the sample size? So what we did is to triangulate multiple sources of data coming from, yes, the surveys being published by NSO Thailand and Philippine Statistics Authority, combine it with satellite imagery, and apply some computer vision techniques. So in particular, what we did is first identify which daytime satellite imagery features are correlated with intensity of night lights. So that gives you a sense of, because intensity of night lights, it's a proxy measure of economic activity. Like areas with higher economic activity tend to have greater luminosity at night and vice versa. So once you're able to identify those daytime image features that are correlated with intensity of night lights, you can then, in principle, make some adjustments in your machine learning algorithm to be able to predict poverty. And since you're working with satellite images, which are in principle available at a more granular level, then you can also predict poverty at more granular level. The beauty in the feasibility study that we did, particularly in the Philippines, is at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially during the quarantine that happened in mid-March 2020, wherein because of the unprecedented impact, you need supplementary resources um, to complement what the government is providing. So ADB acted swiftly during the quarantine around mid-March of 2020 to be able to implement a food relief program and to be able to target the beneficiaries of that food relief program. We use the satellite imagery that we developed using the data for Philippines. And again, this is the advantage of really data integration. We combine satellite imagery with survey data to enhance granularity and then facilitate a more targeted intervention. We're currently doing this in addition to Philippines and Thailand, pilot testing the methodology in other countries and incorporating big data to provide even more granular and perhaps do some nowcasting of poverty, similar to the initiatives that were presented earlier. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oliver, you're up.
Perfect. Hi everyone, and nice to be there at least from a distance. Yeah, I want to quickly present the work we are doing at Save the Children to have micro estimates of multidimensional poverty. So we know from household surveys and general assessments that roughly 1 billion children, so 4 out of 10 children, are living in multidimensional poverty. So that means they, for example, don't go to school, don't have access to healthcare, they're malnourished, or they live in overcrowded places. So basically assessing poverty not through a monetary lens, but through deprivation of rights. And as I just said, those numbers usually rely on household surveys, such as DHS or mixed surveys, which are an invaluable source of information for us, and they're administered in most low and middle income countries every few years. However, there are, as you all probably know, there are small samples which are representative of the total population, but which therefore have restrictions how granular we can actually look at the data. So they're often representative on a national level and one level down, but not. We cannot further zoom into subnational areas smaller than the state or the province on the first level. And this obviously very much restricts our understanding, to know who is actually poor, to direct programs or activities, and just generally understanding the inequality we see in outcomes on that level. So if you can go to the next slide. And while you see a bit of a visualization what we've done, I can describe what we try to do. So we try to create basically poverty maps or small area estimations, if you want to call it that way, to address this challenge. And those poverty maps, as you could just see in the previous presentations and in many others, they're nothing new. So they exist for a long time. However, usually they focus on monetary measures, not on multidimensional one. And that's something we try to rectify, at least for Sub-Saharan Africa. So we worked with the Data Science for Social Good initiative by the University of Warwick and UNICEF to basically use household survey information from DHS survey in this case for Sub-Saharan Africa. So we have like geotagged household survey for roughly half of the countries. And using that, we are basically building a machine learning model which takes that household survey, links it to other geospatial information, including satellite imagery, for example, for night lights, information about public and private infrastructure, and loads of other indicators, and basically try to identify this connection through a XGBoost model, and then predict poverty basically on a very granular level. And we are testing that against the ground truth data, which in our case is kind of an unused part of the household survey rather than census data. And what we come up with is exactly what you see a bit playing out on the screen. We do have a prevalence of poverty, so the head count, the proportion of children which we consider being multidimensional poor. So this is what you see in red on the screen. And then we do have the depth of poverty, or the average number of deprivation, and that's what you see in the different green shades. And those estimates are on like hexagons of 5 kilometers across sub-Saharan Africa. And the prediction quality varies somehow from country to country, but for the first time, this gives us a really detailed understanding on how much child poverty varies in countries and where we would find the poorest children, or where we would expect to find the poorest children. That is all very much still work in progress. So it's really exciting to share that with you all, and we will share it properly in June as part of our new data platform, which is called the Child Atlas, and which is being launched in June, and will bring together loads of information on children across the world, including some of this data. So very exciting to share that with you as part of the UN Data Forum. So back to you, Josh.
Thank you. Okay. Is she here? Mrs. Diane? Is she online? Diana, are you there?
I can see Darshani online.
Hello.
Oh, okay. All right. Diana, go ahead.
Hello.
Diana, you can start your presentation. I'll click through the slides for you.
Hello. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear
Hello.
you. Yep, we can hear you.
Hello. Yeah. Well, hello. Can I start now? Yes.
Go ahead.
Welcome you all to my presentation. As you can see, my presentation is on innovative approach to measure multidimensional poverty, a synthesis method. And this presents a new approach to measure multidimensional poverty, combining the strength of two methods which are predominantly used to measure poverty in multidimensional approach and address some of their limitations. The methods are fuzzy set method and counting method introduced by Alka and Proster. The synthesis method applies the fuzzy set method to resolve the discontinuity problem that arises in identification of deprived people in each and every selected indicators. When the latter is used, Alka and Proster method to identify the multidimensionally poor people. The results process statistic poverty axiom satisfied poverty axioms of good poverty measures. It also incorporates some statistical techniques in selecting indicators and computing weights for the membership function using evidence-based data-driven approach. And it also uses ranking correlation techniques and robustness tests to establish the poverty cutoff. The empirical assessment is done to primary data collected from the Uva province of Sri Lanka, comprising of people representing various socio-economic groups. In applied the new method, we produce 5 poverty indices using the fuzzy deprivation scores of individuals. These are fuzzy headcount index, fuzzy intensity, adjusted fuzzy deprivation index, and normalized deprivation gap index. This study examines how under 3 main dimensions capture poverty: the material deprivation, social dimension, and human capital. As you can see in this presentation, the result revealed that 42.3% of people in this province have a propensity to poverty. These indices of multidimensional poverty incidence give 56% and the intensity 48%. The adjusted poverty head count is 27%. And interestingly, the highest contribution to overall poverty comes from deprivation by social dimension. The application of this method undoubtedly would encourage the analysis of further research of multidimensional poverty. If we further describe the new indices which allow us to see for policy decisions from these indices, it gives how many individuals are simultaneously experiencing various deprivation by different dimensions and indicators independently. Accordingly, programs and policies can be designed to reduce poverty more effectively. These indices can be used for empowerment policies and to reduce inequalities among people based on fuzzy intensity, normalized deprivation gap, and square normalized deprivation gap index. And it can be decomposed by socio groups and various subgroups. These indices also can be used as an instrument for budget allocation, considering the contribution of poverty by dimension and indicators to total poverty. Further, it can be used to govern policy coordination across regions. And these indices can be broken down by sub-regional level, and it can be used to compare poverty composition across region or district or sub regional levels. Further, these indices can be used to track changes in overall poverty and each dimensions and indicators independently. Hence, this indicator can be used according to the new approach more effectively for policymakers to target poverty based on actual situation rather than usually considering of hypothetical situation. That's all my presentation. Thank you
Thank
for your
you.
attention.
All right. Is Dr. C here? No. Okay. The recorded one? All right. I think we have one left then that's recorded.
And good evening, colleagues, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Antra, and I will be very briefly presenting UN Women's work on how we are making use of foresight models to measure the impact of crises on female poverty. We all know that there are multiple crises going on around us, and the biggest of all is the climate crisis. And we now have more and more evidence that this crisis is affecting some groups of people more than others, especially women and girls from the most marginalized communities. So we have partnered with the Pardee Center for International Futures at the University of Denver to use the International Futures Model, which is an open source macroeconomic model with forecasting capabilities to model the effect of climate change on poverty by sex and age. Here, as you can see on the slide, what these numbers are expected to look like in the future, depending upon how harsh the climate change impact will be, so low versus high impact. But what's crucial is that we also model an SDG push scenario, which tells us by how much poverty can be reduced if a comprehensive package of interventions is implemented based on the targets and indicators of the SDGs, including more spending on social protection, investments in the green economy, better infrastructure, and education. The numbers you see here on the slide are preliminary, as this work is still ongoing. But the main purpose of this work is to present to policymakers some simulations on what they can do to reduce the impact of climate change on poverty by sex from a policy perspective. On the slide, you see $90, 320, and 550 international poverty lines, but we'll be revising these to incorporate the new and revised poverty lines adopted by the World Bank, and we'll also be presenting this work at the national poverty line. So stay tuned for more, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you're interested in learning more about this work. Our contact details will be shared via chat, but also feel free to connect with me via the platform. Thank you very much for your time today.
Okay, thank you. Unless our last presenters showed up, that is actually all of them. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, discussions. So if anyone has a question about one of the papers or you'd just like someone to elaborate further, please feel free to put your hand up because we have plenty of time to discuss.
Thank you. I have a quick question for our colleague from Sri Lanka. I think in the presentation, it was focusing on measuring multidimensional poverty. There was an aspect there or dimension on dignity. So this is something that I don't really see very often in other countries' estimation of multidimensional poverty. So I'm just wondering whether our colleague from Sri Lanka could further elaborate how that was operationalized in terms of measurement. Thank you.
Hello.
Well, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for questions. Actually, this can be operationalized by collecting information in many dimensions, the many predominantly used method, the Alkan-Foster method, measuring multidimensional poverty. But same information we can is relevant to the countries. We can collect the information in many dimensions, mainly focusing on human life, not process on income or commodities. But we have to consider means and ends because the data should be related to functioning and capabilities to capture the real nature of poverty. Then, if we identify the dimensions and related indicators relevant to the region or country, then we can apply this method. It's first we have to compute the deprivation of each and every indicators, and then we can apply the poverty cutoff using a statistical base. Uh, in this method, I consider robustness ranking and the other robustness testing to select the poverty cutoff, and then we can use it for uh, to compute the poverty family of poverty measures.
Thank you. I think there
Thank
was
you.
another question.
Okay, thank you very much. My name's Richard Tonkin. I'm from UNSCAP. Just had a question, I guess, potentially for a few of the presenters today, I saw a few presentations where you talked about estimating geographically disaggregated poverty, using machine learning models of various kinds. I know historically, it's been small area estimation techniques, unit level, area level models, which have been used for that kind of estimation. I was just interested whether there'd been any work seeing whether machine learning gives advantages in terms of the the precision or the accuracy of those disaggregated estimates. Thank you.
I think maybe I can take that one because that's basically what our paper is about. So what we did in our paper was we compared a more traditional small area estimator. We did it at the sub area level, not a household level. And we compared it to, I'll use XGBoost just as one example. And we compared accuracy and precision. And so what we found is that relative to, let me clarify that at least in this context where we're using geospatial variables, if we had like an actual census data that we could use, this might be different. But when we're using geospatial data, what we find is that XGBoost improves on SAE by quite a bit in terms of both precision and accuracy. And at least in our paper for this bootstrap method that we use, the confidence intervals are also correct. So it seems to offer better estimates if that's all you care about. But like I said, it always has that drawback of XGBoost. It's kind of black boxy. So you can't really interpret what's going on. And there's a lot of people that still really value transparency in estimation. So that's kind of the trade-off, right? Yeah. I don't know if anyone else wants to add to that.
Let me just like complement what Josh mentioned. So in our case, the study that we did with ADB and NSOs of the Philippines and Thailand, what we found is that the machine learning-based poverty maps produce similar rankings of like villages or very granular geographic areas. But in some cases, the level of poverty are not exactly the same. So it's the ranking that we were able to reproduce. And therefore, we really had to also pay attention to do some calibration to ensure that there's no inconsistency, because otherwise you may end up producing two sets of poverty estimates, and that could potentially confuse your policymakers. But yeah, further work is ongoing to ensure that there is alignment. The idea is you're using data integration, you're using this new data sources to complement the gold standard survey-based small area estimates of way of poverty mapping in contexts where the ideal data sets that you should be using are not readily available. Thanks.
More questions?
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the great presentations. My name is David from UN Climate Change. Two questions basically that I have, I think, to different set of panelists. So, multi-dimensional poverty data, I think, is something. I mean, poverty in particular is a very driving factor for vulnerability to climate change impacts. So maybe to those working in the National Statistics Office, like, is that being factored in when doing the adaptation planning, or are you aware of that? That this is because it has been traditionally like huge gap that in the national adaptation plans that countries are putting forward, or other adaptation plans, that poverty was not really assessed correctly. So do you think that this multi-dimensional poverty approach could improve that measure? And then I had a second question that I now forgot. Let me think of if I can take it back. I'll ask it after this answer, then I probably have it.
I'm not sure who wants to take a shot at that. Diana, do you have anything to say about that with regards to Sri Lanka?
Hello.
Are you? Go ahead.
Hello. Yes.
We hear you.
Yeah. Uh, can you repeat that questions again? So I couldn't capture some words.
So the question was if you have seen in your work for the national adaptation planning, for example, that this multi-poverty assessment has been used there in order to better address vulnerabilities, or do you see a potential there for it to be like really instrumental to this work? If you're not working on this topic, don't worry. I know I put you on the spot here, but that's one of the biggest gaps, for example, in adaptation planning.
Yes, this is actually this method I use empirically for first time in Sri Lanka, but we use any other methods to measure poverty in Sri Lanka. But still, this is a new approach we have produced, and then we see the capturing of some gaps we examined earlier from this method. But still we have not nationally we have not used this, but this approach has been now we are applying for entire country for selecting beneficiaries. This is in multidimensional approach. Now we are still working on that.
Thank you. Maybe I can just ask the follow-up question then maybe to the other panelists. How do you think this will mainstream into poverty assessment over like the more traditional approaches probably to measure poverty, A, and B, so the second question that I now remembered was to, I think, to Oliver from Save the Children. It's like you have had some prediction on poverty, I think. Does that factor in other external factors such as climate change, potential climate change impact, and like a worsening global warming? Because that is, of course, a big driver in this. I mean, I think 300 million people could fall back into extreme poverty due to climate impacts. So is there a level of that, or is that just an extrapolation of past data without taking into account any external factors?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I can maybe just jump in here to answer that, even if I'm not coming from a country perspective, but more from a kind of global or regional assessment. So yeah, for us, we looked at the moment. It's just an extrapolation of past information, right? It's just basically trying to get this granular view based on existing household surveys over the last 10 years or so for Sub-Saharan Africa. However, what you are pointing to, I really love that idea, and partly because we are currently working on that, actually doing exactly that and trying to do an assessment of the links between multidimensional child poverty on the one hand and potential climate exposures as well as actual experiences on the other hand. And we are trying to conduct that research as we speak, and for a publication later this year as part of the Global Coalition to End Child Poverty. UNICEF, Save the Children, and many organizations are part of. So I don't have much to share on that front, just to say that there are some interesting correlations, but they are not as clear cut as we might think when it comes to vulnerability. But I certainly would love to chat more about that, and maybe we can get in touch afterwards, because I think that there is a big underused gap, as you point out, and that was more your question, so I'm just reiterating your question. But if there are country examples where multidimensional poverty is being used to assess vulnerability, I think that would be of very much of interest for us as well. And actually, sorry, just to add on that, Josh, sorry to jump in to say that Mariam from UNICEF Laos is online and is happy to jump in for the presenter who couldn't speak or who couldn't attend. And her presentation is actually exactly on overlaying climate risk and poverty in Laos. So that might be a nice connection there.
Yeah, let's do it. Can we put up the slides again? You said it was Miriam is going to take over?
Yes, and I can see her online, but she's still on mute. Mariam, if you just unmute.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you. We can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. And apologies that we couldn't join. I'm just hearing some background noise. I don't know why. Can you hear me? Can you hear
Yeah,
me?
we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, then. Thank you very much. And apologies that our government partner was not able to make it there. Okay, then. And her presentation is actually exactly on overlaying climate risk and poverty in Laos. So that might be a nice connection there. Thank you very much, Olivia. Can we put up the slides again? Yes, put up the slide, please. Thank you very much. You said it was Miriam is going to take over? Yes. Can you hear me? Yes, I can see her online, but she's still on mute. I don't know why it's showing two.
Yeah, I think there's some kind of lag or something. Can you
Yes,
hear me?
there's an overlap somewhere.
Do you think you can just ignore it and talk through it?
Okay, I can just continue. Sorry about that. There's an overlap somewhere. Thank you very much. And apologies that we couldn't join. I'm just hearing some background noise. I don't know why. Okay, so I'll just continue and ignore that. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share Lao experience. Can you hear me? Yes, go ahead. And thank you very much. And apologies that our government partner was not able to make it there. Okay, so I'll just continue with one because there's an overlay with two different screens. So I just want to start the presentation by just this small anecdote on Kyo Udon. Kyo Udon is a 7-year-old male who has been born with vision impairment. And he comes from one of the southernmost part of the country where you have a lot of climate change challenges. Kyo Udon also comes from a very poor household and has not been able to go to school since he was born with vision impairment. So he's multidimensional poor. But like I mentioned, he comes from a place where there's a lot of climate challenges. So this is the justification behind our own study. Now, why is this study important for Laos? This is, for us, it's very innovative. Like Olivia mentioned, we want to overlay both child poverty and climate challenges and see whether this overlaps of these two critical issues, both severe poverty and climate change, will impact how it impacts the children. I think the beautiful thing about the study is the fact that it looked at small area estimates of child poverty. So it's not just looking at poverty from a provincial level, but it's looking at more in terms of the district level, which is a smaller area estimate, and looking at how it impacts on climate, how climate hazards or environmental hazards impact on that child. Secondly, it also adds to the geographical profiling. Like Olivia mentioned, it's a geographical profiling of each of the districts, now at a smaller area, not at the provincial level. Where are those districts that are actually marring the average? When you have average, it's mass disparity. So where are those areas where we can focus our attention on to reduce child poverty, but also the impact of climate change? It's important for us because it will help us to prioritize when we have to do disaster risk reduction exercise. We know now we don't have much of resources, government resources, so we need something that we can prioritize in case there are emergencies and climate-related emergencies to be able to respond quickly. For us, this is the first step of working towards resolving these two thematic areas, both climate change as well as poverty. Like Olivia also mentioned, I keep on referring to him because he mentioned that it's something they plan to do. We already have started doing this, and one of the critical issues that we're seeing, and I'll relate later, when you look at the map, the graph there, you will find out that in the graph that is shown on the first slide, it shows that the children that are living in that are multidimensionally poor, it's only about a third of children in Laos that are not suffering any deprivation. And I'm sure all of you are aware of the multidimensional deprivations in the 7 dimensions. It's only about a third of the children that are not multidimensionally deprived. So the remaining 2/3 are multidimensionally deprived, which is not acceptable. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So on the next slide, we do today, how did we do this? And basically, how did we do it? Through we want also for us to acknowledge the funding that we received from the government of Ireland to help us to be able to do this. But also the government support, right from the highest level to the vice governors, was also very, very interested. This is the first time that the government, by itself, is willing to do a study and use this as a planning instrument. So how did we do it? We mapped all the elements of child poverty profile using both rate and head count. Now, when you look at rates and head count, the challenge is that when you say rate, when you use only rates, there are provinces that are very small, but they have higher rates. So we are combining both the rate and the head count so that those provinces where even though they have the number of population is low, but the affected the rate is high, we can prioritize based on actual head count. Then we produced similar maps, so maps of climate hazards like airborne diseases, air pollution, vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, and Zika, and then pesticides, and we overlay them with the poverty maps. And by overlaying this with the poverty map, made it very clear where you have children that are multidimensionally poor, that over those where they have high incidence of high impact of climate or environmental challenges. Like I think also referring to what Olivia mentioned, when we looked at it, we were thinking there will be direct correlation between both climate change and environment and child poverty, but it's not that straightforward. Because in some of the, more in the south than in the northern part of the country, you have some correlation. But in some, it is not directly, there's no direct correlation between both climate change and child poverty. And now, what is our own plan going forward? Because it's still an ongoing exercise being finalized by government. We will use, based on the recommendations from this study, we will go and do more in-depth analysis of the selected most impacted districts in the country. We will do more in-depth analysis to find out whether they have infrastructure preparedness for any emergency or crisis, whether social amenities are available and they are in the right condition and are able to sustain the community when there is a crisis. We will also work on preparedness at the national and at the district level to ensure that communities are prepared and are ready when there is an emergency or a climate-related challenges. We also hope that at the end of this whole study and the process itself, that we will be able to use this to influence policies, plans, and legislation for those children that are located where there is high climate impact, that they are able to be supported as a legislation. And that's all from my end, and I'm happy to respond. I don't know whether Enrique is on this call, because this work was done between the headquarters and the country office. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miriam, for jumping in on that. I wanted to let Dan have a chance to answer the question about from David, I think it was, about what you think might happen in the next decade or so with some of these newer methods, and whether you think they might take over some of the older ones, because I know you're always in contact with people that work on that stuff at the bank.
Sure. Thank you, Josh. Happy to try to take a crack at that. So I think even though most of the presentations here used very innovative methods and data sets, a commonality of them is that they also rely on sort of traditional household survey data or census data as a necessary input to train the models. So I don't think there is a scenario where these newer methods take over or replace. You really need, for these newer methods to work well, you still need all the traditional data that national statistical offices are collecting. So I think what we'll see in the next 10 years is not a replacement, but sort of a joining of forces of still high quality survey data being statistical offices, and those data being complemented by these new methods that continue to be refined to create to deal with some of the challenges of the more traditional data, as we touched upon in this seminar. So the difficulties with granularity and timeliness and so forth. So I think it's really joining forces of different data forces to different data sources to create a larger impact.
Thank you. We still have about 5 minutes left if there are more questions. If not, I guess we can wrap up there. There's only 5 minutes left. So join me in thanking everybody for their presentations today. Feel free to get in touch with any of us if you want to have any follow-up discussions about anything we discussed. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.